It's Blade times 2? I bet Harry Knowles is already working up some disgusting sex metaphors. It's Segaiden episode 64. This episode brings us a game about blades that requires the use of the Sega 3D glasses. Thankfully, that game is not Thunderblade, a superscalar port that seems content to make use of the Master System's innate tech to recreate the arcade experience in 8 bits. Let's count our blessings here. Space Harrier 3D appears to have been a one-off experiment, and Sega would never attempt to simulate superscalar effects with a headache-inducing flicker strobe effect again on Master System. Well, not in America anyway. Sorry for the bad news about Outrun 3D, European viewers. So that's the good. The bad is that Thunderblade definitively demonstrates the fact that the Master System simply doesn't have what it takes to host home conversions of Sega's increasingly complex 3D arcade games. The console did just perfectly well with Hang On and Outrun, two very straightforward racing simulations. Take away the bold, chunky, rapid-scaling sprites that made those games so eye-catching in arcades, and you're still left with two damn good racers that don't rely on tech gimmicks in order to be great. Outrun offered a fresh take on racing with its branching paths and breezy aesthetics that pretty much single-handedly inspired synthwave. And Hang On featured fast, responsive bike racing whose inclusion as a pack-in with the console provided the best possible counter-programming to Nintendo that Sega could have conceived in 1986, handily humbling the closest thing the NES had to direct competition. That is to say, Mach Rider. Beyond that though, superscalar simulation has not fared so well on Master System. I mean, Space Harrier was impressive, but the whole thing barely held itself together due to the tech trickery that Sega had to enact in order to pull it off, as seen with Space Harrier 3D a few episodes ago, where Sega's programmers pushed too hard and nearly self-destructed. Afterburner was less of a mess, but it still felt choppy to the point of distraction, and Sega didn't even bother to attempt to recreate Enduro Racer's manic BMX riding and rolling scenery in 8-bit form, opting instead to turn that game into an isometric racer. So you kind of need to calibrate your expectations going into Thunderblade. In arcades, Thunderblade ran on the same X-board hardware setup that powered Afterburner. The X-board did share some technology in common with the Master System. It included a slightly more powerful version of the Zilog Z80 chip found at the heart of the Master System, as well as the SG-1000 before it, and the Game Gear that followed. Except, well, in this case, the Z80 just controlled the arcade machine's Yamaha sound hardware. For the actual game processing, the X-board ran on a beefy Motorola processor, similar to the ones inside contemporary Amiga and Macintosh computers, and it used an intricate custom graphics chipset in order to throw all those sprites around. The Master System, on the other hand, had that Z80 chip and the same 8-bit graphics hardware as always. And that's just not a realistic setup for recreating a game that pushed the X-board spec even harder than Afterburner had. Thunderblade didn't move as fast as Afterburner, or send the horizon line pitching and yawing through 360 degrees of motion. Instead, it offered a new perspective on aerial combat, literally. Thunderblade certainly presented its action through the usual behind-the-vehicle view of previous superscalar games like Afterburner and Space Harrier. Sorry, Space Harrier dude, you're a vehicle now. However, between stages, the camera would switch perspectives, shifting upward while tilting forward to present a bird's eye view of the player's assault craft. In this case, that craft was a combat helicopter designed very much in the vein of the eponymous combat chopper from John Badham's 1983 action flick Blue Thunder. Some adaptations of the game make this pretty explicit, rendering the helicopter with the same Frankenstein Apache Gazelle hybrids seen in the movie. And all of them use a still frame from the movie on their title screen, practically daring Columbia Pictures to sue. Anyway, the shifting viewpoint achieves a few things, all of which are both cool and good. First, it fits the theme of controlling a helicopter. Although choppers can certainly make good time in combat, they're nowhere near as fast as the F-14 Tomcats featured in Afterburner, so Thunderblade needs to set itself apart with a different style of gameplay. The tilting viewpoint allows players to experience the immersive, behind-the-cockpit style that they'd expect from a 3D aerial combat game. but it also taps into the helicopter's combat role of air-to-ground combat and cleanup. The forward-scrolling sequences take place in dense environments, rather than the open cloudscapes of Afterburner. So the overview sequences slow the forward momentum of battle even further in order to allow you to mop up ground-based rabble. The top-down scenes also allowed Sega to employ superscalar effects in a new and different way than ever seen before. The camera transition takes place in real time, cleverly shifting between a fixed overhead perspective and a more forward-focused point of view. This was not something that, to my knowledge, had been seen in a video game that didn't render its visuals with wireframes or vector graphics. Thunderblade offered the exact kind of visual showcase that players were learning to associate with Sega, making this the sort of game you'd pay to play in arcades, if only to watch the cityscape transform from a series of obstacles ahead of you and into a sort of immersive canyon surrounding you. The top-down viewpoints create a simulated diorama effect similar to the one that Sega's home console talent would concoct a few months later with Maze Hunter 3D. Instead of relying on 3D glasses to produce that effect, however, Thunderblade deployed superscalar sprites in a new and different way. Where previous superscalar games expanded sandwiched layers of sprite-based objects from small to large in order to simulate the sensation of forward motion, Thunderblade largely presented its objects at consistent sizes during the overhead scenes. It approached the sandwiched layers concept from a different angle, so that the size and motion of an object relative to the player's movement established its location in space relative to the camera. In Thunderblade's first overhead scene, for example, you sweep through a cityscape, darting through vast urban canyons whose walls are defined by skyscrapers, and whose valleys are populated with tanks taking aim at your chopper. The base of a skyscraper at the bottom of the canyon appears small and moves slowly as you advance forward, and dart laterally to evade enemy fire. But each skyscraper consists of multiple sprites stacked one on top of the other. The higher the sprite appears in a stack, the larger it looks on screen, and the more quickly it zips around the screen as you maneuver. Although this doesn't look like a real building when viewed in motionless isolation, Thunderblade's visual designers get away with this gimmick by relying on the fact that you will never look at the buildings in motionless isolation. The game is always on the move, and the player is always doing their best to dodge incoming projectiles while targeting foes for counterattacks, meaning that the buildings are always in the periphery of your vision and can get by on the strength of impressions and vibes. And it works. Thunderblade's top-down shooter sequences deliver. Your chopper's primary weapons attack in a fixed air-to-ground fashion, and you can fire a more limited form of projectile that flies forward without a set range. And when you make the transition into behind the chopper sequences, the same setup largely applies. Only here, you need to evade more aerial attacks and dodge more dangerous forms of incoming fire. It's one of the standouts of Sega's arcade lineup from the era. If it was perhaps less mind-blowing than Afterburner and less chill than Outrun, it made up for it by showcasing a more varied style of 3D visuals and helping to pave the way for games like Tribes and Halo, where those transitional sequences in full 3D would change the way people thought about their characters' relationship with the virtual worlds surrounding them. That's undoubtedly why Thunderblade didn't simply show up in the Sega Challenge newsletter with its own feature story, but actually graced the cover of issue 4. Thunderblade was a big deal for Sega, and they knew it. The Master System release even got its own dedicated commercial, which Sega didn't do too often for 8-bit releases in the US. I think it goes without saying that Thunderblade demanded far too much from the poor, aging Master System. We're talking 5-year-old hardware at this point, given that the system's CPU debuted in the SG-1000 in 1983. And for that matter, it was pretty much identical to the one in the even older ColecoVision. The Master System obviously couldn't pull off the scaling sprite effects seen in Thunderblade, let alone reproduce the original's seamless transitions between perspectives. The top-down structural stacks were out of the question too. So Sega took a page from the NES world and changed up the game, releasing a sort of remix for the Master System rather than a truly faithful port. It didn't change as radically in transition as Enduro Racer had, but very few games did. But while Thunderblade on Master System generally resembles the arcade game, it makes some fundamental changes to gameplay that in some ways make it feel like an entirely different game. It keeps the dual perspective design alternating between top-down and behind-the-cockpit sequences, but the top-down scenes in particular play pretty differently. Some of the changes result inevitably from the downscaled tech. With the move away from scaling sprites in favor of fixed or moving background tiles, the lateral motion of the arcade game disappears. Thunderblade's top-down portions had a measured pace in arcades, allowing you to slowly pick off ground-based targets while shifting left and right to peer around skyscrapers in search of hostiles. Those game scenes largely emphasized air-to-ground combat, with aerial threats appearing only occasionally and allowing the forward motion to slow or stop as you took on significant threats. Thunderblade on Master System, on the other hand, plays as a forced, forward-scrolling vertical shooter revolving largely around air-to-air action. Your air-to-ground basic weapon becomes an air-to-air weapon, and your alternate fire option becomes a sort of surface-skimming missile that drops from the chopper and automatically launches forward once it reaches the ground. The majority of enemies you face in these scenes engage with your new default weapon, wave after wave of attack chopper formation. The enemy sends helicopters in endless sets of 3 or 4, which come at you in fixed patterns. Ground-based enemies appear much less often, and the slow deployment of your alternate missile attacks make it difficult to hit them all before they scroll off screen. It's even more difficult to dodge the enemy choppers, because your vehicle and theirs have huge sprites with clumsy hitboxes. Playing Thunderblade largely boils down to memorizing enemy patterns, because the top-down stages scroll fast enough and saddle you with such huge moving objects that you can't really get by on simple reaction. That holds true for the forward-scrolling scenes, which also suffer from the change in your chopper's weaponry and lose the lateral movement as well. But the forward sequences make an even more vexing change to the way Thunderblade plays on Master System. They change the nature of enemy fire. In a truly bizarre design choice, enemy tanks, which again you can no longer easily attack with your main weapon, no longer fire their attacks directly at you. Instead, their cannons fire in strange parabolic arcs that swoop slightly down before curving upward. The projectile's movement reminds me of the cannon that Dr. Wily's machine fires in Mega Man. That attack pattern was tricky enough to dodge in a 2D side-scroller running at 60 frames per second. It becomes vastly more difficult to predict and evade in a 3D perspective where the projectiles appear as tiles that don't so much scale as jump rapidly between a few different places and sizes before becoming an active threat. As with Space Harrier 3D, it becomes difficult to judge the spatial relationship between your chopper and the incoming hazards. The Master System was a capable little machine, but Sega really tried squeezing too much performance out of it with games like this. Thunderblade on Master System does attempt to change up its workings to adapt to the console's restrictions, but it ends up straddling an awkward line between new take and faithful take that doesn't deliver on either front. It's a noble attempt to make a profoundly impressive game work in a far more limited environment, but the end result simply isn't fun. The reality is that, well, Sega just needs to stop trying to make this sort of arcade experience work on Master System. What they really need is a new console, maybe one based around the same Motorola Yamaha Z80 chipset as the X-Board. If only such a thing were ever to happen. No, for this episode's 3D nonsense, we look instead to Blade Eagle 3D, a game that absolutely does not need the 3D glasses in order to function. And yet, here we are. I don't know if the name Blade Eagle was meant to resonate with Thunderblade, but fundamentally this game plays like an attempt to recreate the top-down scenes of Thunderblade with the 3D glasses making up for the loss of superscalar tech. Well, kind of. Rather than setting the action in dense environments, like those of Thunderblade, Blade Eagle 3D plays more like a 3D enhanced take on Star Soldier. Remember how you could duck behind scenery in Star Soldier depending on how you approach the structures you encountered in space? Well, Blade Eagle makes that into more of a deliberate player-controlled mechanic. You don't actually fly behind the scenery here, but you can control your altitude with the press of a button. Enemies attack either high or low, and switching altitude allows you to shift to a different plane of action, so that enemies and their projectiles sail right over or under your fighter. Thunderblade's top-down sequences included a sort of half-baked rendition of this altitude adjustment in the arcade, though Sega sensibly threw that out for Master System. Instead, it shows up here, and I guess it could work if the overall experience had been thought through a little more carefully. Unfortunately, it feels every bit as half-baked as the height adjustment in Thunderblade. You could kind of just ignore it there, but Blade Eagle 3D makes that a more difficult prospect since the entire damn game revolves around it. The combat and flight mechanics work around it. Worse, the mandatory 3D glasses requirement emphasizes it. As in Maze Hunter 3D, you can't deactivate the 3D effect with a secret code. Unfortunately, the 3D here doesn't work nearly as well as it did in Maze Hunter. A big part of what made Maze Hunter work so effectively was that its action took place in environments that made full use of the 3D effect and really conveyed a sense of surrounding your on-screen character on all sides. Blade Eagle 3D largely takes place in empty expanses of space or over flat stretches of ground. The environment itself really only comes into play with certain barriers or objects that you need to avoid if you fly at the lower height. There's very little immersion here. The 3D effect only really comes into play for helping you parse your altitude relative to that of your foes, and I can't say that it does a great job of it. The Master System 3D glasses, which somewhere along the way appear to have been rebranded as the SuperScope 3D, have worked remarkably well for me over the course of this retrospective series. Even in games relying on a fundamentally flawed integration of 3D, Space Harrier 3D, I'm looking at you, the 3D glasses present a fully compelling simulation of spatial depth. But for some reason, Blade Eagle 3D really struggles for me. Just as Rescue Mission didn't really want to work with a light phaser, Blade Eagle 3D has a tendency to fall out of sync with the glass's LCD shutters on my system in a way that other 3D games have not. As a result, my eyes don't see a proper 3D image with this game, but rather a slightly dim primary image haunted by the flickering ghosts of the off-eyes frames. An incredibly distracting state of affairs that makes the game much harder to play than it would be if Sega had simply made a normal vertical 2D shooter out of it. There are some things to like about Blade Eagle 3D. The game includes a power-up system that causes your fighter to be trailed by a backup unit or two, kind of like Gradius's options. However, if you lose your primary fighter while flanked by companion ships, control switches over to the companion vessel rather than simply counting as a death and restarting. This makes it a sort of spiritual successor to Starjacker, which is a nice and unexpected nod to Sega's own history. Still, it doesn't work, and the scarcity of 3D visual technology for home gaming systems means that it would be 7 long years before anyone really managed to make this concept work properly. And no one would even play that game because it was Vertical Force for Virtual Boy. Back here in 1988, Blade Eagle 3D and Thunderblade mostly show Sega struggling to realize its technical ambitions in the home console space. The company keeps swinging big, and you have to respect that, but the Master System has grown increasingly hostile to Sega's arcade-at-home dreams. Unfortunately, I think the system's library from this point on will increasingly reflect a mindset of developers working with the tools they have rather than the ones they wish they had. That's probably because, again, a more suitable arcade-to-home console environment was just around the corner. Literally, a matter of weeks away. Next time on Segaiden, the Master System passes go and collects $200. Pony up, losers.